I did warn you last time that the topic we spoke about last time, how to criticize your spouse, is such an important topic that I felt we probably have to deal with it a second time, and I wanted to talk about it tonight as well. So I guess if you need a title for tonight's Vaad, it would be How to Criticize Your Spouse, Part 2. Exactly. Now, what I have to say tonight really shouldn't be a chiddush to anybody, and it's something that we all know. It's a davar pashut. However, as the Mesilas Yesharim says in the introduction, some things which everybody knows at times need repetition. When it comes to criticizing a spouse, usually the spouse needs to be criticized because they did or said something which may have upset, irritated, annoyed, frustrated, hurt, or insulted the other spouse. And when a spouse, or anybody for that matter, feels insulted or hurt, or disappointed or frustrated, generally the reaction is one of resentment or irritation and even kas and anger. Now, while it may be a very natural reaction to be angry when you're insulted or hurt, to attempt to criticize your spouse with kas, with anger, while it may be a very natural reaction, is extremely detrimental, harmful, and destructive. Now, I'm not going to emphasize the ruchnius elements of kas. The Igeres Ramban does that at great length. And he says, of course, that kas is a midah ra lahachti es ha'adam. But that's from the ruchnius standpoint. What I want to focus on tonight is maybe more of the gashmius end of things, and emphasizing how destructive it can be when anyone, of course, reacts in kas, but even more so when we attempt to criticize our spouse from kas. Now, I want to cite two examples to illustrate how destructive kas can be, just to drive the point home. The first example comes from Nach, in Sefer Shmuel. The Navi tells us that Kadosh Baruch Hu told Shmuel the Navi to go to Yishai's house and anoint one of Yishai's sons. And even though Shmuel, a Navi, was a Navi, it doesn't mean that everything was revealed to him at all times, and he didn't know which son to anoint. So the pasuk says that Vayihi b'voyam vayar es Eliyav vayomer ach neged Hashem mishicho. When the sons of Yishai came in and Shmuel and Navi saw them, so he was taken by Eliyav. He was struck by Eliyav. He saw a young man of such gavaltic a stature, and as we'd say, gravitas perhaps today, and good-looking, tall, very regal of bearing. And Shmuel thought to himself, he didn't say it out loud, but he said to himself, Ach neged Hashem mishicho, this obviously must be the individual that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had in mind. In the next pasuk, the Navi says, Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew what Shmuel was thinking. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu responded to Shmuel, and he says, Al tabit el marehu, don't look at his appearance. Ve'el gova komaso, and he's tall, good-looking, attractive. Ki ma'astiu, because I'm disgusted with Eliyav. Ki lo asher yira ha'adam, ki adam yira le'inayim, v'Hashem yira le'levav. It's not always how things appear to the eyes on a surface level. Kadosh Baruch Hu can see into a person's heart and knows the nature and the character of the person. more than a bus of a dumb might notice when he just looks into his face. Now that's a very strong wording that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was disgusted with Eliyav, one of the sons of Ishai, certainly roy to be Melech. So Rashi says, why was HaKadosh Baruch Hu disgusted with him? So Rashi says, Ki mastihu, I'm disgusted with him. Lefisha kasenhu, because he's someone who gets angry. Now think about it for a moment, Rabbosai. Shmuel was coming to anoint the second Melech of Klal Yisrael after Shaul. This was somebody who was descendant of Rus and Boaz. Mashiach was going to come from him. Instead of referring to Malchus Beis David, we could have been referring all the time to Malchus Beis Eliyav. He had an opportunity and he was roy to be Melech. And he lost the Malchus because he was a kaisen. He got angry. In modern parlance, we'd say he had an anger management problem. And for this, he lost Malchus. Now that's the first example I wanted to cite. The second example comes from a couple that I worked with about 20 years ago, a middle-aged couple, came to see me, and it was an unusual situation, and albeit very extreme, but it does illustrate the point I want to make this evening, and that's why I'm citing this couple as an example. When they saw me in my office, both the husband and the wife had such severe anger management problems that even in front of me, they both lost their temper to such an extent that they would scream at each other literally at the top of their lungs. I remember sitting in my office making a quick cheshbon in my mind, thinking, which one of my b'nai bayis are home right now? Even though my office is soundproofed, and you can't hear the words that are being said, but when someone is screaming at the top of their lungs, you can tell that someone's screaming in the office. And I was thinking, if anybody, my b'nai bayis are home, maybe they're thinking the people are screaming at me. They're so upset or annoyed with me. And it didn't happen once, it didn't happen twice, it happened regularly. That something would be said, a comment would be made, and the other spouse would fly off the handle, scream at the top of their lungs, veins bulging from their face. It was really a pachad. And I thought to myself, if this is a couple who was able to lose control of themselves in my office, then Vaad and Vaad, they probably do the same thing at home. And I asked them, does this go on at home? They said, yeah, all the time. I'm used to it already. No. This is something that they live with. Well, maybe they could live with it, but I don't know if their children were able to live with it so easily. To experience that level of hostility and violent shouting and screaming going on in the home. Now, at one point, the mother was sharing with me that one of her children, they were grown out of the house, some were married, some were not. And one of their sons had unfortunately gone off the derech. And he was living on his own in another city. Although he was in touch occasionally with his parents. And at one point, the mother was describing to me what was going on with her son, and the way he was acting, and the way he was speaking, and the way he was communicating with her. And both she and I became alarmed that this young man was in serious trouble. And it became clear to me that he was very seriously depressed and in acute need of psychiatric care. He wasn't living at home. He was living away. But for the next 6 weeks, I was guiding the mother on how to communicate with her son and going over the details of the communications back and forth to try to help her to bring him home so he could see a psychiatrist. Now, it was quite a challenge to help her to help him to come home, which he eventually did, and then to agree to see a psychiatrist, which he eventually did. And she made arrangements for her son to be evaluated by one of the top psychiatrists in Manhattan. And he came home, and the next day he kept the appointment on his own, and he went to see the psychiatrist. Unfortunately, the psychiatrist apparently misjudged the seriousness of the case, because the night after the consultation, this young man took an overdose of medication and committed suicide with all his life. Now, this was a troubled young man, and he had certainly many difficulties and challenges in his life. And it's hard to say exactly what was the one factor that caused him to not only go off the derech, but unfortunately take his own life. But there's no question in my mind that one of the major contributing factors was the level of violence that he experienced in his home growing up, hearing his parents shouting at each other like that, at the top of their lungs. If they did it in my office, they certainly did it like that at home. He was exposed to that growing up, and that had a terribly devastating impact on him, and probably the other children as well, but maybe more so on him for whatever reason, I don't know. I never met him. I wasn't able to work with him, and we were only able to get him to see the psychiatrist, and unfortunately that was not very successful. Now, that illustrates the point I'm trying to make this evening, that when it comes time to criticize a spouse, when we lose control of our tempers and we try to criticize in kas, while it may feel that it's a more effective way of getting the point across, there's a lot of collateral damage that results, and it's a very ineffective way of trying to communicate with one's spouse, and has devastating consequences to the children. And what should a person do if he has an anger management problem? And he tries not to lose control of his temper, but he's not always successful. So I want to cite one more example of a Kol younger man that I worked with about 35 years ago, who came to see me with exactly this problem. Now, if you met him, he'd probably be the last person that you would ever imagine has an anger management problem. He always spoke softly. He was kind of a meek personality, very soft-spoken, quiet, unassuming. Probably the last person in the room that you would imagine that this guy has an anger management problem. But he had a very serious anger management problem. And even though it goes back 35 years, I remember some of the things that he said to me that really touched me, and I really felt for him. He's told me that most people look forward to Sukkot. It's a joyous holiday, it's Man Simchasenu. They don't exactly look forward to Yom Kippur. Not that they dread it necessarily, but it's not their favorite holiday. He said he felt just the opposite. Why? Why did he look forward to Yom Kippur and dread Sukkot? Because Yom Kippur, he knew that with the Amos Hadin of Yom Kippur on the forefront of his mind, he knew he was safe, that he wouldn't lose his temper at home. He knew the Amos Hadin of the Yom Kippur, Yom HaKodesh, would enable him to control himself. That's why he loved Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is one day he knew he's never going to lose his temper. Why did he hate Sukkot? Well, Sukkot, people are not at home, they're in the sukkah. And a sukkah isn't well soundproofed. And when everyone's in their sukkah, everyone can hear everyone else in their sukkah. And unfortunately, for 7 days, he couldn't go without sometimes losing his temper at someone in the family. And he'd raise his voice, and of course everyone in their sukkahs would hear him mouthing off again at one of the family members. Now after he would lose his temper and shout at his spouse or one of his children, he felt terribly embarrassed, guilty, and ashamed. And he was thinking, which one of his neighbors was in their sukkah when he lost control? He didn't know which one, so he'd be embarrassed to meet any neighbor on the street, on sukkahs or after sukkahs, because maybe that was the neighbor that was in their sukkah when he opened up his mouth, and they could just imagine them snickering in their sukkah, thinking, ah, there he goes again, blowing off steam. Most people look forward to the summer, and they're not so crazy about the winter, especially we're having such a cold winter now. He also felt just the opposite. Why? Well, in the winter, the windows are closed. In the summer, I don't think he had air conditioning. He was a Korean Gaman, lived in an apartment. The windows would be open. The windows were open, and he lost his temper, then anyone on the street could hear him walking by. And he'd be embarrassed for anyone in the whole neighborhood, because he never knew who would walk by the street at that time when he was losing his temper. And as guilty and as remorseful as he felt each time he lost his temper, he wasn't able to control himself. He felt terrible about it. And I felt sorry for him. And I still remember the first day he came into my office. First thing he did when he sat down, he said to me, before we start, I just want you to know, I don't believe in therapy. Okay? No one ever began a session like that. But certainly the first session. I said, okay, so tell me why you don't believe in therapy. He said, look, nothing personal, he said, but I just want you to know before we get started that I don't believe in therapy. Look, we believe, and I see you're a Frum Yid, we believe that all chachma, all wisdom comes from Torah. Do you deny that? He said to me. I said, no, of course, I'm with you on that. We're on the same page. Well, if all chachma comes from Torah, then who are the ones who are best versed in Torah? I said, you tell me. He said, it's the Rosh Hashivas, right? I said, of course. I'm with you on that too. He said, well, if all chachma comes from Torah, and the Rosh Hashivas are the best versed in Torah, then they should be better versed in Torah than you. You probably had to go to college to do what you're doing now, to be a therapist. I said, I'm guilty as charged. Yes, I did go to college. He said, now you may have gone to yeshiva too. I'm not questioning yeshiva background. But certainly when you went to college, you weren't in yeshiva. So you weren't studying full-time, at least when you went to college. I said, that's true. I admit it. And the Rosh Hashivas are the best versed in Torah. I said, I agree with all of that. So what's the point? He said, well, my point is that the problem I came to see you about, I've discussed with some of the biggest Rosh Hashivas alive today. And he mentioned their names, and you will all be all familiar with the names that he mentioned, that he consulted with this problem. He said, and they were not able to help me. Now, if they were not able to help me, and they're the best versed in Torah, then how can I expect you to help me when you're not as well versed in Torah as the Rosh Hashivas? I said, look, I tell you the truth, I can't argue with that logic. There was a long pause. And I said to him, but tell me something. Can I ask you a question? He said, sure. I said, if that's the way you feel about therapists, and that's the way you feel about therapy, why did you make this appointment to see me in the first place? He looked down very sheepishly, and he looked up and he said, my Rosh Hashiva sent me. I said, okay, so let's get down to business. Tell me why you're here, and let's see what I can do to help you. And Baruch Hashem, Be'ezus Hashem, I was able to help him. with his anger management problem. The reason I mention this is simply to drive home the point that if someone does have an anger management problem, they shouldn't continue to suffer and cause the B'nai bias to suffer. There is help available, and a person should seek help to overcome the problem. Because if somebody is resorting to anger as a way of trying to correct their spouse at home, or they're criticizing their spouse in anger, even though they may have very good reason to be upset, and they were hurt, and they were insulted, and frustrated, and disappointed, to allow anger to enter in to communication with your spouse when you're trying to offer some words of criticism is very ineffective, it's very counterproductive, and it's very destructive. And as I said at the outset, this may be very obvious, and it may be something we all know. But as the Mesilas Yesharim said in his introduction, sometimes things that we all know, we need to be reminded of. And if only one person who's here at the Vaad or listening to the tape or watching the video is helped not to lose their temper, especially when they're about to criticize their spouse, then the whole session was certainly worthwhile. I just want to remind everybody that the next Vaad will take place in 4 weeks, Be'ezus Hashem, on March 13th. And if there's any inclement weather or any reason to check if the Vaad is being held on time, you can get in touch with Reb Yitzchak, who's the coordinator. I want to remind everybody also to submit their questions and suggestions and topics to Reb Yitzchak. We will continue with your suggestions that you've already submitted, Be'ezus Hashem, next time, but I wanted to spend this one more time on this very crucial subject. Thank you all for coming.